everybody. My name is Nicola, and I'm here to tell you a story about coasts and waters. And as you walk along the coast, you can't help but fail to notice the concrete defences left from World War II, the lookouts in fear of invasion. Well, that invasion never came, but the war at sea was a brutal, brutal war. And wrecks from that conflict litter the seabed. German submarines, U-boats, planned to target the merchant ships that were providing food and supplies coming into Britain. And those merchant ships formed convoys and had a destroyer escort that would pick off the U-boats that were known as the Grey Wolves and hunted in packs. Winston Churchill himself said the only thing he feared during World War II was the U-boat menace. And my story today is a story of a U-boat. But I have to warn you, it is a pretty disgusting and smelly tale involving bodily functions. I like to call it Daz Poop. It is the smelly tale of U-1206. You see, the Type 7 U-boat was the warhorse of the German U-boat fleet. The length of 2 railway carriages and designed for 24 men. But they carried 48 to 50 men. So there was very little space. The men had to hot bunk. One would sleep, one would work, and they'd swap over. And the bunks were very, very small indeed. Those men who worked in the torpedo room where all the weapons were, they didn't have bunks. They had hammocks across the room. So it was in their interest to fire as many torpedoes as possible so that they'd get more space. And because there wasn't much room, the men were not allowed to take very much with them. So they didn't change their clothes. They didn't change their pants or their socks. And a U-boat mission could go for 6 to 12 weeks. So it got really rather stinky in those boats. Water was strictly rationed, fresh water that is, and the men preferred to drink it rather than wash with it. So it got very smelly and sweaty, as you can imagine. They were issued with a special soap that they could use with salt water, but the men didn't like that. It made their skin itchy. So they didn't wash at all and just used liberal quantities of eau de cologne. And they didn't shave either, so at the end of a voyage, the men would emerge looking like hipsters. And 12 weeks in a tin can with very little light led to them having a deathly pallor. And the damp and the diesel fumes caused their skin to form boils and blisters as well. And their lips would start to chap and chafe. And there was even a department in Berlin to look at the skin conditions of U-boat crews. But despite all this, men were clamouring to join the U-boat fleet. There weren't conscripts in those days. They were all volunteers and they were highly skilled men. These were like electricians and engineers, and they went through rigorous training. They had to be up to the job. They had to know their job and the job of the man next to them and be able to cope with living in such a confined space. And of course, the U-boat crews, they were treated like rock stars. They got all the girls. That's when they'd had a shave and sorted their skin out, I'm sure. And the men who commanded the U-boats were known as the aces, depending upon the number of merchant ships that they had sunk. And they were invariably called the Alta, the old one, even though they were little more than 30. They were the father figure for the men. They were the heart and the soul and the brain of the ship. They were the only man that knew where they were going, and they had to make decisions in full view of the rest of the crew. They were the only man that had their own bunk and a little bit of privacy with a curtain, and that was it. And these men, well, they loved their men, and the men loved them. And they were real characters. One would organise singing and lying competitions, another would ensure that the men's teeth were brushed at night, and another, when the U-boat was being depth-charged, when it was being bombed by a destroyer, he would read a book to show how calm he was to his men so nobody else would panic. It was pointed out to him that the book was upside down. The conditions that the U-boat crew were working in, not only were they smelly and highly dangerous, but the sea, the Atlantic, terrible seas and awful conditions, and well, of course there would be a lot of seasickness, but these men couldn't stop working, so they formed little vomit cans, little tin cans that they had around their necks where they could throw up and continue working, and of course that added to the smell. And they would eat their food wearing their oilskins, moving around from side to side as the boat went through choppy waters. And one of the most important people on the U-boat was the cook. He was there to cook 3 meals a day, and there was a routine, and that was really, really important. He had a little galley kitchen by the diesel room, and he didn't go on watch because he was giving the men food throughout the day and the night. And his job when the U-boat was being attacked was to keep his pots and pans as quiet as possible, because noise travels through water. So he had to be careful that they weren't smashing about in his galley kitchen. The U-boat crew were given very good food. They had fresh food for the first few weeks, and then it reverted to canned food, and they distributed the food all through the boat, including the toilet. Yes, I'm getting to the toilet now. There were 2 toilets on a U-boat, but one was used for the storage of food, the one nearest the galley kitchen and the diesel room. So there was just one toilet for 48 men. So that was pretty smelly as well. It got worse than that though, because you could only use the toilet when you were on or near the surface. If the U-boat was submerged, you had to use a tin can or a bucket. And of course, the buckets and the tin cans would always fall over, and it would get even smellier in that U-boat. But technology was ever advancing, and by 1944, they had devised a toilet in a U-boat that could be used when the boat was submerged. It had a very complex, high-powered flushing mechanism, a kind of poop torpedo. It was so complicated that every U-boat had its own trained poop engineer, a man designed to operate the toilet. And so we get to the tale of U-1206. Unlike British submarines, who had names like Trident and Triumph, the German U-boats were given numbers. And U-1206 made its maiden voyage in 1945 on the 6th of April. This was at the very end of World War II. Gone were the aces of old. The U-boat threat was no longer a threat. The war at the Atlantic had been lost. They had lost their bases in France. It wasn't eager young men volunteering to join the U-boats. They would take anybody, and the training was very hasty. These were not the elite crews of old. And U-1206 was under the command of Captain Schlitt. It was his maiden voyage, and he wasn't one of those great alters, the brains, the heart of the boat. It set out from Norway on the 6th of April for a tour around the North Sea. And on the 14th of April, Captain Schlitt wanted to do a number 2. The boat was submerged. And he decided, as he was the captain, he wasn't going to consult the poop engineer. He would take the manual with him. So he sat on the toilet with the manual, and he couldn't make head or sense of it. He called his second engineer, the LE, and they looked, but they couldn't make sense of it. They were looking at the captain's log and looking at the manual, and then they pushed a lever. But it was the wrong lever, and seawater and poop came pouring into the U-boat. This wasn't only disgusting, this was very, very dangerous. Because U-boats, when submerged, run on batteries. These are not little ever-ready batteries. These are huge batteries that weigh tons. And seawater getting into the battery released chlorine gas. Dense, green, choking fumes irritate the lungs and the breathing tubes. The men began to choke, and Captain Schlitt had no alternative but to bring the boat up to the surface, open the hatches so the men could breathe. He brought the boat to the surface, 12 miles off the coast of Aberdeen, in full view of Allied aircraft that, of course, opened fire on this enemy boat. The crew surrendered, scuttled the ship, as was practice in those days, and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. The wreck of the U-1206 lies on the seabed off the coast of Aberdeen to this day. And that is the story of the only submarine that is sunk by its own toilet gas poop. Thank you.